Chattanooga, Tennessee. It's Nooganomics with David Toulis.
There's a big story that about the intervention of the state in the marketplace that is worth considering, and is one that we haven't thought really anything about. It's about the adoption racket, and there's money that goes from state and federal government to parents who are given children in adoption. And there is according to an attorney who's become specialist in this area, it involves millions of dollars. The money goes to tens of thousands of state workers across the country, and you could say collateral professionals such as lawyers and court personnel and investigators, evaluators, guardians, and judges. And we have in Tennessee the Department of Human Services, and there's also a division that cares for children. And there you'll find other hangers-on of the federal and state monetary tit, if you will, counselors and therapists and junk psychologists, people who run residential facilities, foster parents, adoptive parents, big brothers and big sisters organizations dotting the landscape, YMCAs, and other organizations. And to talk a little about this with us is Connie Reguli, who is in Nashville. She's a Nashville attorney. Her practice is called Law Care Family Law Center. She has been 20 years in practice. She has 3 of her own children, all of whom have their own offspring. So Connie is a grandmother. Connie, welcome to Nooganomics.com.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me today.
What's the story that we have not heard about regarding the adoption process and a great feeding organization behind it? Describe what's happening.
Okay, well, I heard you mention adoption racket, and I want to take this and make this a little bit bigger step, and that is, first of all, sort of the underlying theme here is child abuse. Now, everybody, when you hear the word child abuse, that's a very emotional issue. Nobody wants a child to be abused, and I don't either, okay? So I want to get that straight before we go forward. But what has happened is that there has been a systematic development of a child abuse industry that ultimately could be considered as a child trafficking, a child rehoming effort that is funded by our tax dollars, by our government. So we have children being removed from homes. They are put into a foster system, and then there's a permanent placement resolve, which means they have to either go home or they have to go into an adopted home. So what we have to go back and look at is what is the financial motivation all the way along the line, and where does the money go? So in Tennessee, if you look at our public policy says that reunification of a child with their parents, the child-parent relationship is one of the most sacred things that there is in our state, and yet that's not how the money is being used. Do you follow me on that?
So you're saying that the money is being used for purposes other than delivering children removed from their homes back to mom and dad?
Correct. So it all starts with, we have to go way back if we really want to look at the history of this. There was a series of federal legislation that started occurring in the 70s, and the very first one was child abuse legislation, and sometimes it's called the Mondale Act. And they started creating funds and entitlements through the Social Security Act, which would give states money to prevent child abuse. And then over the years, that developed until it became more and more about children in foster care. So now you have what's called Title IV-E funding out of the Social Security Act. That is an uncapped source of money for the states. It's not affected by sequestration. It's not affected by budget cuts. It is an uncapped source of money. And so, as with most federal money, there are strings attached to it. So you have to look at what are the strings? What does the state have to do to get that money? And so what the state has to do to get the money is put children in foster care, because the money can only be used for foster care. It cannot be used to provide services to a family to prevent removal. It cannot be used after reunification to provide any support for the family. And it can't even be removed if an agency receives a call about a child and they go to a home, and let's say there's some environmental neglect, which basically means it's got a dirty house. They can't use the money to help that parent sort of restore their home and leave the child in the home. They can only use the money for foster care. Now, how does that sound for starters?
Well, it sounds like you're subsidizing one form of life, if you will, and you're going to get more of that form of life in culture.
Right. Right. Okay, so now you have Title IV-E funding, which is all financially incentivizes the foster care. So what do you do with that? So what does that mean to the states? If the states don't use their money for any given year, they lose it. So it's a use it or lose it policy. And so every year the state has to generate enough children in the foster care system so that they continue to have that funnel of money running. Now, on most of these federal programs, the state only has to make a 25% match of the funds. So that means 3/4 of their money for the operation of this system comes from the federal government. So if you turn to a state legislature and you say to the state legislature, you know, you need to cut the spending. You need to cut your spending. So let's look at the Department of Children's Services and cut spendings. Well, that translates into the mind of a state legislature that I have to cut $4 if I'm going to save the state $1. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Well, not quite, but keep going.
Okay, so you've got this agency that has become this mammoth who is feeding off of federal money. And they cannot cut down what they're doing, and they can't change what they're doing because they have become so dependent upon that money.
Well, is the state of Tennessee agreeing with this, Connie, regularly? Is the legislature increasing its 25% share as it seeks to, as the state seeks to gain more of the 75% federal payload?
Oh, absolutely, because it's financially, the state is financially incentivized to be able to get the money is to put children in foster care. So it's a back and forth. It's a back and forth. The state is not going to, now keep in mind that the state had to enact certain laws. They had to put certain laws on their books which would make them eligible to receive that money. Now, so let me tell you a little bit about those laws and how they've gone awry. So you have under the federal legislation, you have that before a child can be removed and before a child can qualify for this funding in foster care, the court has to make a finding of, quote unquote, contrary to the welfare of the child to remain in the home. Okay, so it sounds like a good idea, right? It sounds like, well, a judge has to make a finding that is contrary to the welfare of the child to remain in the home before they're going to get the money. Well, here's what happens. They train judges to put in their orders that language, regardless of the situation, because their funding is dependent upon that language. Okay, you got me? You follow me on that one?
But does that requirement for that verbiage, does that alter the judicial perception of the judge? Does that make the judge more in favor of removal and foster care?
Yes. So you have judges who don't want to, I mean, you got to remember this whole entire system is funded by the welfare agency motivation to put children in foster care. So I'm not talking just about DCS or the Department of Children's Services. I'm talking about the juvenile court judicial system. I'm talking about the foster care system. I'm talking about all these private agencies that are getting money and funds from this same system. So you have, for instance, in Tennessee, one of the largest private contractors is called Omni. Omni has a contract with the state of Tennessee for over $50 million to provide foster care services. Now, our current head of DCS, the Commissioner Jim Henry, he used to be the CEO of Omni. Okay? So in 2011, when our last commissioner of DCS politely stepped down off of her position because 31 children had died in foster care, Governor Haslam appointed Jim Henry to serve as what's called the temporary commissioner of the Department of Children's Services. However, that was 2011. This is 2015. He's still there, so it doesn't sound very temporary to me. But what we have to ask ourselves is, why would a person who had the largest state contract for foster care be in the position of determining whether or not our children remain in their homes or go to foster care? Sounds like a little bit of a conflict of interest to me. How about you?
Well, I think you're right. But so we have Omni, which has, you say, a $50 million contract for foster care, and its revenues come from, do they come directly from the U.S. Treasury, or do they come from either the Department of Human Services or the Department of Children's Services? How does that money? How is it laundered?
That's a good question. So Omni contracts with the state of Tennessee.
Okay.
The state of Tennessee pays Omni with federal funds. Okay? That's part of the money that they receive under what's called Title 4E. The money that they receive is to pay for foster care. So Omni is not the only one in Tennessee. There are several churches that run foster care who are also making money off of this. And then let's take a look at some of the other industries that benefit from this. Let's talk about the medical and mental health profession. So you can put a child in foster care because they have some psychological defect, or there's allegedly some type of occurrence in their home, or they have a parent who is mentally unstable. And so you've got a mental health industry who has a whole subsection here, a whole revenue area of declaring that a parent is mentally unstable and therefore cannot parent their child. And then you have the medical industry. Now, if you go, and I have finally figured out how to get to the Tennessee checkbook, you can go online to Open Government, and you can scroll down and find your way through it. You can go to the Tennessee checkbook, and you can search it by vendor. Vanderbilt is one that I have searched. Vanderbilt gets millions of dollars from the state of Tennessee. A lot of that money comes directly through the Department of Children's Services because they use Vanderbilt as expert witnesses in child abuse cases. All right, so you may say, well, of course, Connie, you got to have a medical doctor, right, to say it's child abuse. Let me give you an example. I had a case where a young mother, 19 years old, sweet girl, never had a traffic ticket, okay? No drugs, nothing in her background. She had a baby. The baby was 7 months old. The baby rolled off the bed while she was doing laundry, and he fell on the floor, did not have a head injury, but he had a little swelling in his leg. And so she took him to the doctor. The doctor says, you need to go to Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt did an x-ray on his leg. He had a little fracture right around his knee. So she spends the next 7 hours in the hospital being interviewed by police and detectives and DCS, and we have doctors who say the only way that injury could have occurred is if she picked that baby up by the leg and swung him around her head. That's what the child abuse expert doctor said. Now, I got all the medical records. I happen to have a very good relationship with a man who specializes in child abuse, a pediatrician who's been practicing in the child abuse area for 40 years. He's in Boston. I was able to, in modern day, I can get those records to him through an email. So I sent him all the records. He examined the x-rays. He examined everything that the doctors had said, and he said, no, that's not correct. The child, in falling off the bed, could have hit his leg, landed and twisted his leg, and could have caused that fracture. Now, had I not had that doctor available to me within a 24-hour notice, that child would have gone in foster care. So you have a whole area of the medical industry called child abuse specialists. Now, you've heard of specialists in arthritis and heart disease. I mean, so think about it. You've got to have child abuse to be able to justify their existence, right? And so everything that they are going to do a diagnosis on is going to be related to child abuse.
Which other groups are patronized by the state in this field? You've mentioned two. What are some other ones? Connie Ray.
Well, So you have the foster care industry, you have the medical industry, you have the mental health industry, and then let's talk about the courts. So you have the courts, and a lot of this goes through a juvenile court system. Well, once you get into the juvenile court system, there are attorneys who get appointed and paid by the state, and this is another level of dollars that you don't see because it doesn't really show up under, when you look at DCS budget, you don't really see this. But when you get into the court system, you have attorneys who get appointed by the judges to serve in the roles as guardian ad litems or who serve as attorneys to represent parents, and they all get to bill the state for their time. Now, because these people, most of these attorneys who that's all they do is do that kind of work, they have to basically please the court and please DCS to be able to keep this continuing source of revenue. I mean, these are attorneys that they usually, sometimes they work out of the back of their car. They don't have to have insurance. They don't have to have an office. They don't have a staff. They really just do this one role in their life. So it's a guaranteed source of revenue for them as long as they can continue to keep the appointment.
This is David Toulis. We're talking with Connie Reguli, who is an attorney in Nashville. Her practice is Law Care Family Law Center, and she's describing what is effectively an industry that profits on child abuse charges and maybe some instances of child abuse, feeding the foster care system. Well, Connie, how many children in Tennessee are in the foster care system, and what percentage would you guess really need to be in that system because they have dangerous situations at home?
Okay, that's a good question. So if you look at the DCS stats, there's a couple things that come to mind. First of all, you need to know that the DCS gets over 300,000 calls a year. All right, now those calls, remember that first of all, they're anonymous. Nobody has to tell who is calling. As a matter of fact, it's against the law to tell who's calling. So what do you think that prompts? Just like any time you have secrecy, it prompts fraud, right? So you have jealous ex-husbands, jealous ex-wives, teachers who are mad at parents who call and, say they think this child's being abused. So you get 300,000 calls a year. So you have in the Tennessee foster care system, and you can check out this statistic, there is a website called kidscount.org. Kidscount.org is an organization who gets grant money to run statistics on all the states, and they have statistics on children on all the states. It shows that Tennessee's foster care placement runs roughly 8,000 a year. It bounces up and down from 7,600 to 8,200, but you will see the number of children entering foster care is roughly the same over the past 5 years. You'll also see, you can check and see how many children are exiting foster care. And you'll also see that the number runs about the same as well. It's a little bit lower. So you have, when you look at Tennessee, you go, 8,000 children a year entering foster care. Either we are doing a really poor job of educating the public on taking care of children, or that is a quota. And so I'm here to tell you that is a quota, and that's the number that Tennessee strives for every year. Now, how many children should be there and how many children should not be there? There are different organizations throughout the country. There are different parents' rights group. There are different, you can't find this number out publicly, so you have to go through other sources and what they've studied. And they have found that up to 70% of those children should have never been removed or who should have been promptly returned to the parents once an emergency situation was taken care of.
So promptly would mean within a day or two?
Yes.
So 70% of the children in the foster care system, by these various studies, suggest should not be in state custody. But if that were the case, then if those 70% were not there, you are telling us, Connie Reguli, that the money flow from Washington would stop.
Exactly.
Well, what kind of budget are we talking about? You mentioned the Department of Children's Services, and I have a graphic from the Department of Human Services of Tennessee. That department has 90% of its money from the federal government. What about DCS? Talk about its budget and give us a sketch of its size and scope.
Okay, so you've got, and you can actually pull up the DCS budget. You can find that online. You pretty much just type it in and Google, and you can actually get the actual published budget from DCS. So, again, I have a pie chart in front of me, and, it's kind of difficult to read this pie chart, but because it shows, now in this pie chart, it shows 46% of the money is state money. However, what that is not taking into consideration are some of the other funds that don't show up in the DCS budget, such as there's also Title VII funds, there's Title 19 funds, and there's Title 20 funds. So we have, this shows for 2014, Title 4E funds of $874 million. They're saying that's only 11% of their budget. But I'm telling you that there's something about this that is not reported square on. Because if you read the congressional reports and it talks about Title 4E funds, the state only has to provide a 25% match to that. So you also have got Medicaid, which is also flowing into, that's another thing. We haven't even talked about that. TennCare is like the biggest part of the Tennessee budget. And so that is something you hear about all the time, that TennCare is going bankrupt, but they can't control it. Well, what happens is every child who goes into foster care is placed on TennCare. Every single child. So you have all of this TennCare money going out and feeding into this system as well.
How much does a family get for a foster child held in its bosom?
Okay, that's a good question too. So Tennessee, the regular state foster care funding to a parent runs about $780, $800 a month. Now that is just a normal, regular, everyday child, okay? So now we can start to categorize those children. If we categorize that child as a special needs child, then they can get additional money. Now, when I say special needs to you, you might be thinking, oh, that would be horrible. That might be, a child with cerebral palsy or something serious. Well, no. It might be a child who has an IEP at school. It might be a child who's...
Individual education plan?
Okay. Might be qualified as a special needs child where they could get additional money. So then you have children also going into this forced adoption plan. So in Tennessee, termination of parental rights, which is, I think, from a legal standpoint, a very scary thing because it is the death sentence to a family. Terminating the rights of a parent is a death sentence. It's worse than going to jail because at least in jail you can get out at some point. So the termination of parental rights in Tennessee can come from the failure to pay support for 4 months. It can come from the failure to visit for 4 months. So, and then there's also, of course, a series of other things. But the DCS system and the termination of parental rights system is all directed at placing children in adoptive homes because that's a whole nother fund out of Washington. The adoption assistance money is a whole nother fund. The state gets $4,000 for every child that they adopt out. So that's just bonus money. And then you've got the adoptive parents that get money to take care of those children. A lot of times those children will stay on TennCare for the rest of their life. They will continue to get adoption assistance. They get money when they get the children to buy them clothes and to get some special services for them right up front. And when you stop and you look at it, if you really take that dollar amount, you have to ask yourself, what would happen if that same money were provided to a family in need?
Connie, this is David Toulis. We're talking with Connie Reguli, who is an attorney in Nashville. We're talking about the child abuse industry in Tennessee and how it might affect you, my listener. I've got some things I want you to hear. Hang on.